The US dollar has fallen more than 10% in 2025, approximately 10.8% in the first half of this year. That is the worst start to a year for the dollar since 1973. But here's what nobody is talking about. This isn't an accident. This is a plan. Trump's Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, and his chief economic advisor, Stephen Miran, have been openly discussing a strategy to deliberately weaken the dollar to bring back manufacturing. They're calling it the Mar-a-Lago Accord, a modern version of the 1985 Plaza Accord that successfully drove down the dollar by 40%. So let's get this straight. Your government is actually working to make your dollar worth less. And they're telling you it's for your own good. Today, we're going to break down exactly what they're planning, whether it's actually worked, who's tried it before, and most importantly, what it actually means for you in your daily life. My name is Elizabeth Ann Stewart, and you are watching Geopolitics and Money. Follow the money, decode the world. Let's start with what Trump's own team is saying, because they're not exactly being subtle about this. Scott Bessent, Trump's Treasury Secretary and former hedge fund manager who famously worked with George Soros, by the way, wrote in January 2024, weakening the dollar early in his second administration would make U.S. manufacturing competitive. A weak dollar and plentiful, cheap energy could power a boom. A strong dollar should emerge by the end of his term if the U.S. reshoring effort is successful. Okay, read that again. Weakening the dollar early is the stated goal. But Bessent walks a tightrope. In public testimony, when directly asked about the administration's dollar policy, he stated, "No one should listen to anyone in the markets talk about the U.S. dollar other than President Trump or myself. We have a strong dollar policy." Note the careful phrasing. He says they have a strong dollar policy, not that they want a strong dollar right now. Very clever right there. The real blueprint comes from Stephen Miran, Trump's choice for chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. In November of 2024, Miran published a paper titled A User's Guide to Restructuring the Global Trading System. In it, he argues that the root of the economic imbalances lies in the persistent dollar overvaluation that prevents the balancing of international trade. He explicitly states, while many analysts believe there are no tools available to unilaterally address the current misvaluation, that is not true. Miran proposed the Mar-a-Lago Accord, a coordinated plan to deliberately devalue the dollar. The strategy? Use tariffs as leverage to force trading partners like Europe, China, and Japan to accept a weaker dollar. Countries that don't cooperate face punitive tariffs. Countries that do cooperate get tariff relief. It's currency manipulation with a smile and a threat. This isn't a new idea. They're literally copying a playbook from 1985. Back then, the US dollar was massively overvalued. The Federal Reserve under Paul Volcker had jacked up interest rates to kill inflation in the early 1980s, which made the dollar surge. From 1980 to 1985, the dollar had appreciated by about 50% against major currencies like the Japanese yen and the German Deutschmark. The result? American manufacturers couldn't compete. The US developed large trade deficits, reaching 3.4% of GDP. The country lost 2 million manufacturing jobs between 1980 and 1985. Sound familiar? So on September 22nd of 1985, finance ministers from the G5, the US, Japan, Germany, France, and the UK, met at the Plaza Hotel in New York and reached an agreement. They would coordinate intervention in currency markets to deliberately drive down the dollar. And it worked. In the 2 years, 1985 to 1987, the dollar fell 40%. The US trade deficit improved substantially. And by 1991, the US current account balance had moved close to a surplus. Success, right? Well, sort of. For Japan, the Plaza Accord became a cautionary tale. The yen appreciated dramatically from 242 per dollar in September of 1985 to 153 in 1986, just a year later, and around 120 by 1988. To counteract this massive currency appreciation, the Bank of Japan engaged in aggressive monetary stimulus, slashing interest rates and flooding the economy with money. This led directly to Japan's massive asset price bubble of the late 1980s. The Nikkei index hit record highs by 1989, only to crash soon after. When that bubble burst, it triggered Japan's lost decade, actually multiple lost decades of deflation, low growth, and economic stagnation that Japan is still dealing with today. So yes, the Plaza Accord worked to weaken the dollar and improve the US trade balance, but the side effects for Japan were catastrophic and lasted for generations. Now let's talk about the elephant in the room, China. For decades, China has been accused of keeping its currency artificially weak to boost exports. And unlike the Plaza Accord, which was a temporary coordinated intervention, China did this systematically for years. Between 2001 and the early 2010s, China purchased more than $2.2 trillion in foreign exchange reserves to maintain an undervalued yuan. Economists estimated the yuan was undervalued by 40% or more relative to the US dollar during this period of time. This acted as an artificial 40% subsidy to China's exports and a 40% tax on imports from other countries. It gave Chinese manufacturers an enormous competitive advantage. Paul Krugman called China's currency policies predatory and estimated they reduced world GDP by about 1.5 percentage points. The US repeatedly accused China of currency manipulation and threatened sanctions. Treasury Secretary after Treasury Secretary filed reports. Congress threatened tariffs, but China largely ignored the pressure and continued the policy for years, building up their manufacturing dominance. By the time China finally allowed the yuan to strengthen, it appreciated 35% against the dollar over the 2000s and the 2010s. They had already built an unassailable manufacturing base. The damage to American industry was already done. So we know currency manipulation can work to boost manufacturing. China proved it. The question is whether the US can pull off the same playbook, only in reverse. Now here's the part that nobody is talking about. This weak dollar strategy isn't just about bringing back manufacturing. It's also about managing unsustainable debt. The US is currently in what some economists, like Lynn Alden, who is one of the brightest minds in the space, calls fiscal dominance. A situation where government debt is so massive that it effectively constrains what their Federal Reserve can do. When you're in fiscal dominance, the central bank can't fully focus on controlling inflation because it has to keep the government solvent. Here's the math. The US debt is $37 trillion as of this recording and climbing. That's 124% of nominal GDP now, and expected to just grow and grow. The government is spending $882 billion, that's almost $1 trillion per year, just on interest payments. That is more than defense or Medicare. And here's where currency devaluation becomes a hidden escape hatch. When you deliberately weaken your currency and allow inflation to run higher, you're effectively making your debt cheaper to repay. It's called inflating the debt away. The nominal amount you owe stays the same. It's still $37 trillion. But the real value of that debt shrinks because you're paying that back in dollars that are worth less. Think about it. If you owe someone $100 today and inflation runs at 5% for 5 years, while your currency weakens, you're still paying back $100 in nominal terms. But in real purchasing power terms, you're paying back maybe $78. You've effectively defaulted on $22 without actually defaulting. Foreign creditors holding trillions in US treasuries, countries like China and Japan, who are dumping them by the way, get paid back in dollars that buy less than when they lent them. It's a partial default disguised as monetary policy. So when Besant and Miran talk about weakening the dollar to boost manufacturing, they're solving two problems at once. First, make exports more competitive to bring back manufacturing jobs and tax revenue. Second, create the conditions for moderate inflation to erode the real value of America's $37 trillion debt burden. The weak dollar isn't just industrial policy, it's also stealth debt management. That's why Lynn Alden calls it nothing stops this train. The fiscal deficits are structurally baked in. You can't cut Social Security or Medicare without political suicide. You can't cut defense without geopolitical tensions rising. You can't raise taxes enough to close a $2 trillion annual and growing annual deficit. So what do? You try to grow and inflate your way out. Weaken the dollar, create inflation, bring back manufacturing to boost tax revenues, and let inflation quietly reduce the real burden of the debt. It's a high wire act. If it works, you get manufacturing jobs and higher growth and manageable debt. If it fails, though, you get inflation without growth, stagflation, and potentially lose reserve currency status in the process, which seems to be well underway. But from the perspective of policymakers staring at an unsustainable debt trajectory, it might be the only play left. So will this strategy actually work? Here's where things get complicated because what worked for China in 2005 is probably not going to work for America in 2025. First, the global economy is fundamentally different than it was in 1985. Back then, central banks routinely intervened in currency markets and financial flows were smaller. Today, private investors control massive amounts of capital that dwarf what governments can deploy. You can't easily manipulate markets when private capital can overwhelm any government intervention. BlackRock. Second, the dollar's role as the reserve currency creates a catch-22. Miran himself recognizes this. Trump wants to keep the dollar as the world's reserve currency while also weakening it to boost manufacturing. But those two goals are fundamentally at odds. Countries hold US dollars because it's strong and stable. If you deliberately weaken the US dollar, you undermine the very reason people hold it. As one analyst put it, trying to force countries to keep using your currency you're actively devaluing makes the use of the dollar appear to be a favor to the US instead of something logical, which could actually accelerate de-dollarization. Third, manufacturing takes years to build. Even if a weaker dollar makes American exports more competitive tomorrow, you can't just conjure up factories overnight. The US has spent decades hollowing out its manufacturing base. Supply chains have moved, expertise has been lost, infrastructure has unfortunately deteriorated. Trump has announced flashy investment projects, but analysts note that many of these endeavors are months or even years from coming on the line. In the meantime, Americans will just pay more for imports without seeing the manufacturing jobs materialize, if they rematerialize at all due to artificial intelligence, AI. And fourth, The geopolitical landscape is fundamentally different. In 1985, Japan was a close US ally that ultimately cooperated. Today, China is a strategic rival that has no incentive to help the US succeed. Europe is wary after Trump's tariff threats, and nobody wants to volunteer for the role that Japan played. All right, so let's cut through the economic theory and talk about what a deliberately weakened dollar actually means for your life. When the dollar loses value against other currencies, imports become more expensive. And spoiler alert, America imports enormous amounts of goods from other countries, from electronics to clothing, to cars to food. This actually hits consumers directly. An economist at Rutgers explained it simply. If you're buying light fixtures from a firm in India and they're taking dollars, they get fewer rupees for those dollars. They're going to start to charge more. And it's not just luxury goods. As one analyst noted, the dollar-related price hike would hit just about every import entering the US. The dollar has already fallen by about 10%, and if you want a really crazy stat, how much it's fallen in the last 100 years, which is 95%, analysts warn this could prove inflationary, shocker, as imported goods become more expensive and retailers pass these along to their consumers. Translation: combined with tariffs, the weak dollar policy could amplify inflation, especially going into the holiday shopping season and, for the foreseeable future. If you travel, you will feel it immediately. International vacations become more expensive. That hotel in Paris or Tokyo, that was already expensive by the way, costs more because your dollars buy fewer euros or yen. Multiply that across flights, meals, activities, and your vacation budget just took a serious hit. For investors, it's mixed. If you hold foreign assets or international investments, great. They're worth more in dollar terms. But if your wealth is tied up in typical American retirement accounts like 401ks, you're looking at reduced purchasing power. Your savings aren't growing as much in real terms, like real terms in the real economy. For homeowners and borrowers, high inflation from a weak dollar typically means higher interest rates. The Fed has to fight inflation by raising rates, which means more expensive mortgages, car loans, and credit card debt. And here's the kicker. Until America actually succeeds in building more domestic manufacturing capacity, which could take a decade, you're paying higher prices without seeing the benefits of more American jobs. That is, if they're ever coming, because most people's jobs are very likely to be replaced by AI robots. And that's not a joke, unfortunately. I will say more about that in another video. You are bearing the cost of the transition with no guarantee the transition will succeed. At the end of this 4-year term, this presidency is on its way out, but you still live in the United States. The bottom line. So let's recap what's happening. Trump's economic team has a deliberate strategy to weaken the dollar by as much as 40% over the next few years. They're using tariffs as leverage to force other countries into a new Plaza Accord style agreement. They believe this will bring back American manufacturing and create jobs. They're right that a weaker currency can boost exports and manufacturing. China proved that for 2 decades. The 1985 Plaza Accord worked to reduce America's trade deficit. But they're also betting that the side effects won't be catastrophic, that America won't end up like Japan with decades of stagnation, that inflation can actually be controlled, that the dollar won't lose its reserve status, and that manufacturing will actually return in meaningful numbers. Those are big bets. In the meantime, American consumers are going to pay higher prices. Your dollars will buy less. International travel will get more expensive, inflation pressure will build up, And there's no guarantee that in 5 or 10 years, we'll have the manufacturing renaissance that they're promising. Scott Bessent says this is about rebalancing the economy away from Wall Street and towards Main Street, towards small business and manufacturing. Well, that sounds really great, but economic history suggests that deliberately devaluing your currency is playing with fire. It can work, or it could trigger massive unintended consequences that echo for decades. The dollar has been the world's reserve currency for 80 years. Weakening it on purpose while still expecting it to maintain that status is definitely trying to have your cake and eat it too. Maybe they'll thread the needle. Maybe this really will bring back American manufacturing without tanking the economy or sparking runaway inflation. But for now, the only thing we know for certain is this: your dollars are going to be worth less, and you're going to pay more for imports. And the people making these decisions are telling you to just trust the process. So in closing, whether this is brilliant economic strategy or dangerous hubris, we'll find out over the next few years. But you can't say they didn't warn you. They published the playbook. The question is whether the American people are ready to pay the price for this economic experiment while they wait to see if it works. Thank you for watching. If this video helped you understand what's really happening with the dollar, hit that subscribe button. Drop a comment and let me know, do you think deliberately weakening the dollar will bring back American manufacturing, or is it going to backfire spectacularly? All right, I'll see you in the next video. And a big thank you to our Patreon members. If you want to support the channel and get extras and behind the scenes content, check out our Patreon at patreon.com/GPIC. Bye for now.